They told her he did not smile. This was the first thing she learned about the Duke of Blackmore, before she knew his Christian name, or the color of his eyes, or the way he held a pen, or any of the other small human details that make a person real, rather than a title on a marriage contract. They told her he did not smile, and they told her this not as gossip, but as preparation, in the way that a mother might tell a child about the depth of a river before permitting them to swim in it. Her mother told her first. They were sitting in the upstairs parlor of their house on Charges Street, the afternoon light coming through the west windows and falling across the embroidery frame that neither of them was using, and her mother had set down her teacup with the particular care of a woman who's about to say something difficult and wishes to have both hands free for the saying of it. "He is respected, Lydia," her mother said. "He is honorable. He will provide for you in a manner that exceeds anything your father and I could have hoped. But I will not send you into that house without telling you what I have heard, which is that he is not a warm man. He does not make conversation for pleasure. He does not attend gatherings unless duty requires it. He has lived alone at Blackmore for 6 years, since his father died, and the staff say he walks the grounds at night and takes his meals in his study and has not hosted a dinner since the old Duke was buried." Lydia had listened to this with the quiet attention she brought to all information, sorting it, weighing it, placing it alongside what she already knew. She was 21. She was the only daughter of Sir Edward Harcourt, a baronet whose estate in Sussex produced enough income to keep a family comfortable, but not enough to attract the kind of offer that had arrived without warning 6 weeks earlier. A letter from the Duke of Blackmore's solicitor, formal and precise, proposing a match between His Grace and Miss Lydia Harcourt, with terms so generous that her father had read the letter twice to make sure he had not misunderstood the figures. "Why me?" Lydia had asked when her father told her. Her father had been honest, because he was always honest, sometimes to a fault. "I do not know," he said. "We have met the Duke once at the Hargreaves' dinner last autumn. You sat beside him. I cannot imagine it was the conversation. You told me afterward that he barely spoke." Lydia remembered the dinner. She remembered the Duke, tall, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked as though it had been set in stone, and eyes that moved across the room with the watchful precision of a man who was cataloging everything and enjoying nothing. She remembered that he had spoken very little, and that what he had said was brief and correct and entirely without charm. She remembered that he had not smiled. She also remembered, and she had not told her father this, that halfway through the third course, a footman had stumbled while serving the fish and spilled sauce across the tablecloth, and the Hargreaves' hostess had gone white with mortification, and 3 guests had laughed, and the Duke had not laughed. He had looked at the footman, who was 18 or perhaps 19, and was standing frozen in the particular agony of a young person who has just made a public mistake they cannot undo. And the Duke had said, quietly and without fuss, "These things happen. The sauce is excellent regardless." And the footman had exhaled, and the table had moved on, and the Duke had returned to his silence, and no one else appeared to have noticed what he had done. Lydia had noticed. She had not fallen in love with him over a spilled sauceboat. She was not that kind of woman, and this was not that kind of story. But she had filed the moment away in the place where she kept observations that did not fit the available narrative, and when the proposal arrived 6 weeks later, she had retrieved it and looked at it again and thought, "The man they are describing to me and the man I saw at that table are not the same person." She said yes. The wedding was held at Blackmore because the Duke did not come to London unless compelled, and because Blackmore was where they would live, and because Lydia's mother, who had a practical streak beneath her anxiety, said that a bride should see her house before she was expected to run it. They arrived 2 days before the ceremony, Lydia, her parents, and her mother's sister, Aunt Constance, who had opinions about everything, and expressed them with the confidence of a woman who had been married for 31 years and considered this sufficient qualification to advise on all matters of domestic life. Blackmore was enormous. It sat in a valley in Derbyshire, stone and slate and ivy, with grounds that stretched to the river on 3 sides and a wood on the 4th that was old enough to predate the house by several centuries. The entrance hall was twice the size of the Harcourt's entire ground floor. The staff numbered 28. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrich, was a tall woman with gray hair pinned tightly and an expression that suggested she had been managing the house through sheer force of will and was relieved, though she would never say so, that someone else was finally arriving to share the weight. The Duke met them in the entrance hall. He bowed, He welcomed them. He showed them to their rooms personally, which surprised Lydia's mother, and which Lydia recognized as the behavior of a man who did not know how to delegate hospitality because he had never had anyone to delegate it to. He did not smile. The ceremony was brief and correct. 40 guests, mostly neighbors and local families who seemed genuinely pleased that the Duke was finally marrying, and who looked at Lydia with the particular curiosity reserved for a woman who has agreed to do something that most people considered either brave or slightly mad. The vicar was elderly and kind, and spoke too quickly, and the Duke said his vows in a voice that was steady and low and carried to every corner of the chapel, and Lydia said hers in a voice that was clear and did not waver, and when it was done, they walked out into the June sunlight, and the small crowd threw dried lavender, and Lydia's mother cried, and the Duke stood beside her with his hands at his sides and his face composed, and if he felt anything at all, he kept it where no one could see. The wedding breakfast was adequate but strained, the way meals are strained when the host is a man who has not entertained in 6 years, and the guests are people who do not know the bride and are trying to assess her without appearing to stare. Lydia managed it with the composure she had learned from 21 years of being a baronet's daughter at tables that were never quite grand enough. She spoke to everyone who spoke to her. She complimented the cook's work. She asked questions about the estate that were specific enough to be interesting without being so specific as to be presumptuous. The Duke watched her do this from the far end of the table, and if she had looked at him at the right moment, she might have seen something on his face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, a softening at the corners of his mouth that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before the stone resettled. She did not see it. Mrs. Aldridge did. The day wore on. The guests departed. Lydia's parents retired to their rooms, her mother with a final embrace and a whispered, "You will be all right, my darling," that Lydia absorbed without replying to, because replying would have meant admitting she was uncertain, and she did not wish to be uncertain on her wedding day. Aunt Constance said something about the curtains in the east wing that no one responded to. The house grew quiet. Lydia was shown to her rooms by Mrs. Aldridge. They were large, well-furnished, connected to the Duke's chambers by a door on the east wall. The bed was a 4-poster with deep green curtains. The fire had been laid and lit. Someone, Mrs. Aldridge, she suspected, had placed a small bunch of wildflowers on the bedside table, the kind that grew along the river path, not hothouse flowers, but real ones, with dirt still faintly visible on the stems. Her lady's maid helped her change into her nightgown, brushed her hair, and left with a curtsy and an expression that was trying very hard not to be sympathetic. Lydia sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the connecting door and the fire and the wildflowers, and thought about everything she had been told. He did not smile. He walked the grounds at night. He took his meals alone. He had not hosted a dinner in 6 years. He was not warm. She thought about the footman and the fish sauce. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The fire crackled and settled. The house made the sounds that old houses make at night, creaking, ticking, the particular sigh of timber that has been standing for 200 years and intends to stand for 200 more. Lydia began to consider the possibility that he was not coming at all, that the connecting door would remain closed and the first night of her marriage would pass in the silence of 2 people on opposite sides of a wall, each waiting for something neither knew how to begin. Then there was a knock. Soft. Not on the connecting door, on the main door from the corridor. "Come in," she said. The Duke entered. He had changed from his wedding clothes into a shirt and dark trousers, no coat, no cravat. It was the most informal she had ever seen him, and the effect was startling. Without the armor of his tailoring, he looked younger than his 34 years, and less certain and more human than the stone-faced figure who had stood beside her in the chapel that morning. He was carrying something in his hands. She could not immediately see what it was because he was holding it carefully, close to his body, the way one holds a thing that is fragile or a thing that one is embarrassed to be holding. He stood just inside the doorway. He did not come further into the room. He looked at her, sitting on the edge of the bed in her white nightgown, her hair loose over her shoulders, the firelight on the left side of her face, and for a moment he seemed to be struggling with something, not words exactly, but the mechanism by which words are produced, as though the distance between what he wanted to say and what he knew how to say was a gap he could see but could not cross. "I am not good at this," he said. Lydia waited. "I am not good at—" He stopped. He looked down at the thing in his hands. Then he crossed the room, not quickly, not slowly, with the deliberate pace of a man who is making himself do something that frightens him, and he held it out to her. It was a book, a small book, bound in dark blue leather, worn soft at the spine and corners. She took it and turned it over and opened the front cover, and saw in a child's handwriting the name Edward Cavendish, and beneath it, in a different hand, a woman's, the words, "For my darling boy, who will learn to be brave." "It was my mother's," he said. "She read it to me when I was small, before she died. I have not shown it to anyone." Lydia looked at the book. It was a collection of fables, animals who spoke, forests that moved, rivers that answered questions. The pages were soft with handling. Several had been turned down at the corners, and on one page in the margin, someone had drawn a small star in pencil beside a passage. And Lydia understood without being told that the star had been drawn by a woman who wanted her son to remember that particular sentence, and that the son had remembered, and that the book had been kept in a drawer or on a shelf for 26 years, waiting for a moment that its owner deemed important enough to bring it out again. "I do not know how to be a husband," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the fire, or at the wall, or at the space between things where a man's gaze goes when he is saying something he has never said before and cannot bear to watch being received. "I do not know how to make conversation that is not about the estate or the tenants or the drainage of the eastern field. I do not know how to be easy or amusing or any of the things that I understand a wife has a right to expect. I have spent 6 years in this house alone, and before that I spent 8 years watching my father die slowly and managing the estate while he could not, and I have become a person who does not know how to be in a room with another person without wanting to leave it." He paused. He seemed to gather something, not courage exactly, but the will to continue past the point where stopping would have been easier. "But I wanted you to have this," he said, "because it is the most valuable thing I own, not in money, in the other way. And I thought that if you had it, you might understand something about me that I do not know how to explain, which is that I am not cold. I am not what they say I am. I'm simply a man who lost the only person who knew how to reach him, and who has been unreachable ever since, and who would very much like to be reached again, if you are willing to try." Lydia held the book in both hands. The leather was warm from where he had been holding it against his chest. She could feel the indentations of the child's handwriting through the cover, the ghost of a name pressed into leather 30 years ago by a boy who had not yet become the man standing in front of her, rigid with the effort of vulnerability. She looked up at him. His face was exactly as it had been all day, composed, controlled, unreadable, but his hands hanging at his sides were trembling, not dramatically, not visibly, unless you were looking for it, but trembling, the way hands tremble when the body knows something that the face is refusing to admit. Lydia stood up. She set the book on the bedside table beside the wildflowers, and then she did something that surprised them both. She took his hand, not both hands, one hand, his left hand, which was closer. She took it in both of hers and held it, not tightly, not loosely, but with the steady, certain pressure of a person who is telling you without words that they are here, and they are not going anywhere, and you do not have to perform or explain or apologize for who you are. His hand stopped trembling. They stood like that for a long time. Neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The house settled around them, and in the silence, something began. Not love, not yet, but the conditions under which love becomes possible. Trust, patience, the willingness of two people to stand in a room together without pretending to be anything other than exactly what they are. "Would you read to me?" she said. He looked at her. "What?" "The book," she said. "Your mother's book. Would you read to me from it?" Something happened to his face. It was not a smile. It was not the practiced arrangement of features that society calls a smile and uses as currency in drawing rooms and ballrooms and across dinner tables. It was something rawer and less controlled, a cracking, a fracture, a moment in which the stone that he had built around himself shifted, and what came through the gap was not warmth exactly, but the memory of warmth, the recognition that warmth had once existed and might, if he allowed it, exist again. He picked up the book. They sat on the edge of the bed, side by side, not facing each other, which was easier for a man who could not yet bear to be looked at while he was being honest. And he read to her. He read the fable about the fox who could not find his way home in the river that offered to carry him, and his voice was low and unsteady at first and then steadier. and Lydia listened with her hands in her lap, and her shoulder touching his shoulder, and the fire burning low in the grate. And when the fable ended, she said, "Another one." And he turned the page and read another. And the night passed, not in the way that either of them had expected, but in the way that it needed to. Slowly, gently, one story at a time. She did not ask him to stay. He stayed. He fell asleep in the chair by the fire sometime after midnight, the book still open on his lap, and Lydia pulled the blanket from the foot of the bed and laid it over him without waking him, and then lay down and listened to the sound of him breathing and thought, "They are wrong about him. They are all wrong about him." The weeks that followed were not easy. He did not transform overnight into a man who smiled and made conversation and moved through rooms with ease. He was still silent at breakfast. He still walked the grounds at night. He still retreated to his study for hours at a time. And there were mornings when Lydia sat across from him at the dining table and felt the distance between them like a physical thing. 3 feet of mahogany and a lifetime of solitude that could not be bridged by a single evening of fables. But the book stayed on her bedside table. And every night, without discussion, without ceremony, without either of them acknowledging that it had become a ritual, he came to her room and read to her. Sometimes a fable, sometimes a chapter from whatever she was reading, sometimes a letter from a tenant or a passage from the estate records that he wanted her opinion on, which was his way of saying, "I trust your mind," without using those words, because he did not yet have the vocabulary for that kind of declaration. She learned him the way one learns a language, slowly, with mistakes, with long stretches of confusion punctuated by sudden startling moments of clarity. She learned that his silence was not coldness, but exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who had spent 8 years being responsible for everything and everyone, and had never once been asked how he was bearing it. She learned that he walked the grounds at night because the house felt too large when it was dark and quiet, and he was the only living thing in it. She learned that he had dismissed every invitation and canceled every dinner, not because he did not want company, but because the effort of pretending to be well when he was not well had become more than he could sustain. She learned that his mother had died when he was 8, and that his father had begun dying, slowly, from a disease that took his legs first, and then his speech, and then his mind, when Edward was 18, and that for 8 years Edward had managed the estate and sat in the House of Lords and maintained the appearance of a functioning, competent duke while watching his father disappear by degrees, and that by the time the old duke finally died, Edward had nothing left. Not grief. He had spent the grief in installments over 8 years. Not relief. He was too tired for relief. Just emptiness. The emptiness of a man who had been holding something up for so long that when it was finally taken from him, his arms did not know how to come down. Lydia did not try to fix this. She understood, with the intuition of a woman who listened more than she spoke and observed more than she performed, that he did not need to be fixed. He needed to be accompanied. He needed someone to sit beside him in the silence without trying to fill it, to walk with him on the grounds at night without asking why, to be present without demanding that her presence be acknowledged or rewarded or reciprocated on a schedule. So she did that. She walked with him. She sat with him. She learned the estate through Mrs. Aldridge and through the steward, a careful man named Fenton who had been managing the practical details for years, and who regarded the new Duchess with the cautious optimism of a man who has been carrying too much weight and sees a second pair of hands approaching. By October, the house had changed. Not dramatically. There was no renovation, no reordering of rooms, no sudden blossoming of flowers and music. But the curtains in the east wing were opened because Lydia liked morning light. The dining room was used for dinner because Lydia suggested that eating in the study was bad for digestion and worse for posture, and the Duke had looked at her with something approaching amusement and agreed. Mrs. Aldridge hired a second kitchen maid because the Duchess had noticed that the cook was overworked and had mentioned it with the gentle precision that had become her particular talent. Never a complaint, never an instruction, just an observation placed in the path of the right person at the right moment. The tenants noticed first. Not the changes to the house, and they rarely saw the interior, but the changes to the Duke. He came to inspect the drainage on the eastern field in November, as he did every year, but this time the Duchess came with him, and the Duke introduced her to the tenant farmer by name, and the tenant farmer's wife offered them tea, and the Duke accepted, which he had never done before, and they sat in the tenant's kitchen for 20 minutes, drinking tea from chipped cups and discussing the winter wheat. And when they left, the tenant farmer told his wife that the Duke had smiled, and his wife said he must have imagined it, and he said he had not. He had not imagined it. It was small. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It happened while Lydia was telling the tenant farmer's wife about the roses she was attempting to grow in the south garden, and the wife had said that roses were temperamental and required more patience than most people possessed, and Lydia had said, "Then I am well suited to them." And the Duke, standing by the door with his tea, had smiled. Not the polished performance of a man in society. The real thing, involuntary, unguarded, gone almost before it arrived, but real. Lydia did not see it. Mrs. Aldridge, who had accompanied them, did. The first dinner they hosted was in December, a small gathering, 8 people, neighbors who had known the old Duke and who arrived with low expectations and left 3 hours later with the dazed expression of people who have just witnessed something they did not think was possible. The food was excellent because the cook had been given adequate help and adequate notice and had responded as good cooks do by producing the best meal of her career. The conversation was not easy. The Duke was still the Duke, still quiet, still more comfortable listening than speaking. But Lydia sat at the other end of the table and managed the flow with such natural skill that no silence lasted longer than it should, and no topic veered into territory that would make her husband retreat. At the end of the evening, when the guests had gone and the candles were burning low, the Duke stood in the entrance hall and looked at the empty chairs and the cleared table and the quiet house and said, "That was not terrible." Lydia, who was halfway up the stairs, turned and looked at him. "High praise," she said, and he laughed. Not loudly, not for long, but he laughed, a sound so unfamiliar in that house that Mrs. Aldridge, who was supervising the clearing of the dining room, stopped what she was doing and stood very still and pressed her hand to her mouth and did not move again until the sound had finished and the house had absorbed it like stone absorbing rain. Christmas came. Lydia's parents visited, and her father played chess with the Duke every evening for a week and lost every game and enjoyed every one. And her mother sat with Lydia in the morning room and said, "He is different from what I expected." And Lydia said, "He is different from what he expected too." In January, Lydia discovered she was carrying their child. She told him in the evening, in her room while he was reading to her. They had moved beyond the fables now, into histories and essays, and once, memorably, a treatise on sheep husbandry that the Duke had found genuinely interesting, and Lydia had endured with the patient determination of a woman who understood that love sometimes meant listening to detailed analysis of wool yields. She told him simply, without preamble, because she had learned that he received information best when it arrived without decoration. "I am expecting a child," she said. "Sometime in August, the doctor believes." He set the book down. He looked at her. And then he did something he had never done before. He reached across and took her hand. Not the way she had taken his on their wedding night, gently, patiently, as an offering. This was different. This was a man holding on to something because he was afraid that if he let go, it would prove to have been imaginary. "Lydia," he said. "Yes?" "I need to tell you something I should have told you months ago, and I have not told you because I was not certain I had the right to say it, and I was afraid that saying it would make it less true, which I know is irrational, but I have never been accused of being rational about the things that matter." She waited. "Oh, I chose you," he said, "at the Hargreaves' dinner, not because of your face or your family or your father's connections, though your father is the best chess player I have ever met, and I include the Bishop of Durham in that assessment. I chose you because a footman spilled sauce on the tablecloth, and every person at that table either laughed or pretended it had not happened. And you looked at the footman with an expression that I have only ever seen on one other face in my life, which was my mother's. You looked at him as though he was a person who had made a mistake, and not a servant who had committed a failing. And I understood in that moment that you saw people the way I wished I knew how to see them, and I wanted to be near that. I wanted to learn it. I wanted to be in a house with someone who saw the footman." Lydia was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You saw the footman too. You told him the sauce was excellent." "I said what was correct," he said. "You felt what was kind. Those are not the same thing." "They are closer than you think," she said. He did not agree, but he held her hand, and she held his, And outside, the Derbyshire winter pressed against the windows, and the house stood as it had stood for 200 years, solid and patient, and finally, after 6 long years of silence, inhabited. Their son was born in August, a boy they named James, after the Duke's father. He had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and a temperament that veered between serene contentment and furious indignation with very little territory in between. The Duke held him for the first time in the bedroom where Lydia had recovered, and Mrs. Aldrich, who was standing by the door in case she was needed, watched the Duke look at his son's face and saw his expression do something she had waited 6 years to see. He smiled, fully, openly, without restraint or self-consciousness or the rigid control that had governed his face for as long as she had known him. He smiled at his son, and the smile stayed, and it did not look like a man learning something new. It looked like a man remembering something old, something that had been there all along, underneath the stone, waiting for a reason to surface. Their daughter arrived 2 years later, Catherine, named for the Duke's mother. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's composure and an early fascination with books that pleased both of her parents equally and for different reasons. The Duke read to her every night, the same fables from the same blue leather book in the same low voice, and Lydia listened from the doorway and did not interrupt, because she understood that what was happening in that room was not a bedtime story. It was a restoration. It was a man returning to the last place where he had been loved without condition, and finding that he could go back there after all, and that the door had never been locked. He began to smile more. Not often, not easily. He would never be the man who lit up a room or charmed a table or made strangers feel instantly at ease. But he smiled at Lydia across the breakfast table when she said something dry about the drainage reports. He smiled at James when the boy attempted to ride the kitchen cat. He smiled at Catherine when she brought him a book and said, "Read," with the imperious certainty of a 2-year-old who knows what she wants. He smiled once at a dinner party in London, a large gathering, 50 people, the kind of event he would never have attended 3 years earlier. A young footman, carrying a tureen of soup, caught his foot on the edge of a rug and stumbled, and the table went quiet with the anticipatory silence of people who expect embarrassment, and the Duke looked at the footman and said, "Those rugs are a menace. The soup smells excellent, by the way." The footman exhaled. The table laughed, with him, not at him. And Lydia, sitting 6 chairs away, caught her husband's eye and saw on his face the expression she had first seen across the Hargreaves' dinner table 3 years earlier. Not a smile exactly, but the evidence of a man who saw people, who had always seen them, and who had simply needed someone to see him back. Years later, when James was old enough to read the fables himself, and Catherine was old enough to insist on reading them aloud to anyone who would listen, Lydia found the blue leather book on the shelf in the nursery and opened it to the page with the penciled star in the margin. The passage was from the fable of the fox and the river. She had read it before, many times, but she read it again, standing in the nursery with the late afternoon light on the page and the sounds of her children playing in the garden below, and she understood why a mother had drawn a star beside it, and why a boy had kept the book for 30 years, and why a man had carried it to his wife's room on their wedding night and handed it over with trembling hands and hoped that she would understand what he could not say. The passage was about finding your way home. It was about a fox who had walked so far and for so long that he had forgotten what home sounded like, and a river that said, "You will know it when you hear it, because it will sound like someone saying your name as though they are glad you are there." Lydia closed the book. She put it back on the shelf. She went downstairs and found Edward in his study, working on the estate accounts with Fenton, and she stood in the doorway and said his name, and he looked up. And there it was, the thing they had told her he could not do, the thing he had spent 6 years forgetting, the thing that a book in a hand and a night of fables had taught him to remember. He smiled. "If that stayed with you, the next one might too. They arrive here, like a knock on a door you did not expect, whenever they are ready."